Hi guys, Olive here. Today I am here to bring you my January 2017 wrap-up and my February TBR. This month turned out to be a pretty interesting one. I did not start off this reading year on quite the best note and some unexpected things happened, but I did end up reading a total of 9 books. If you saw earlier in the month, I did a tipsy book discussion about DNFing, which was inspired by the first 2 books that I encountered this month. I had a stroke of bad luck, and the first 2 books that I picked up this year, I ended up DNFing. The first of those was a buddy read I was doing with Stephanie from Time to Read, which was Moscow in the 1930s by Natalia Gromova. I had really high hopes for this book, not only because I was buddy reading it with Stephanie, but because the awesome publisher Glagoslav sent me this for review. I was excited about this book because of what it says on the cover. It says a novel from the archives, and that's what I thought it was going to be. I guess I thought this book was going to be a novelization, a dramatization of what this author found in the archives, since she spends a lot of time going through them. This book does cover real life historical figures that were living in the Soviet Union at this time, most of whom were literary figures, people in the arts. So when I first started this novel, I was really yearning for an in-depth examination of how difficult it would have been being an artist living in repressive communist Russia under Stalin. I was also hoping to get some sort of vivid imagining of the interconnectedness of these authors, since they were very much a community. Instead, what I got was kind of a word vomit of names and places and events with nothing to connect them. I found it really uninteresting. And I am a Russian history junkie, so this one, unfortunately, was DNF'd. The other book I DNF'd, I made it through the majority of the book before just spoiling it for myself because I couldn't take it anymore. That was The Monsters of Templeton by Lauren Groff. This was yet another buddy read that I attempted to do with Kathy from Another Great Etc. I had been really interested to pick up Lauren Groff's other novels after I loved Fates and Furies in 2015. It was my second favorite book of the year. I still think about it all the time. Right away, I knew that this book was going to be drastically different than what I had experienced in Fates and Furies, but I was more than willing to give it a chance. The basic plot of this book is that there is a female graduate student who returns to her small hometown in New York State, disgraced and potentially pregnant after having an affair with her professor. Very, very soon after our main character, Willie, arrives back home to stay with her mother drops a bomb on her that her father is not some mysterious stranger that she had a one-night stand with, but instead is someone within their town, although she won't say who. However, her mother does give her a small hint, and from that nugget of knowledge, Willie starts to dig through the history of the town, trying to find out who her father is and becoming more enlightened about the town in general in the process. I like that concept, but the story is incredibly weak in execution. There was really oddly placed magical realism. The dialogue was completely unbelievable, like wannabe Gilmore Girls but never getting there. The main character was so unlikable, but in a totally uninteresting way. And the whole time I was reading this, I was at a loss that the author of this book is the same woman who wrote Fates and Furies. Given that this was her first novel, I am willing/wanting to believe that she needed to push through this in order to get to the amazing writing that was ahead of her. It's the only explanation I can come up with. DNF. Both of these books I'm now getting rid of because unless they're going to start paying rent, I don't want them in my home. The rest of the books I read in January were much better, starting off with You Are Not So Smart by David McRaney. I listened to this one on audio. This is a nonfiction pick all about human psychology and the plethora of ways that we delude ourselves every single day. It was very similar to The Power of Habit, but where The Power of Habit really zooms in on one aspect of human psychology, habit formation, this book discussed a variety of different psychological effects that keep us from seeing things as they truly are, the psychology of self-delusion. It talks about a ton of different psychological phenomena, a lot of which are extremely well known. Like if you've ever taken even a basic psychology class, you've probably heard of some of these. But because so many are discussed in such a short book, they are individually less memorable. And like my comparison before, The Power of Habit goes in depth about one facet of the human brain, gives anecdotal evidence, thoroughly discusses the implications of each of these case studies. The lack of depth in favor of breadth really work to this book's disadvantage. This book is written extremely casually, which could be a pro or con depending on your taste. I did find it interesting. I did learn some things, but when the majority of a book starts to fade away almost immediately after I finish it, it's not getting more than 3 stars from me. The biggest surprise of the month for me was High Strung by Quinn Dalton. This is the book that I picked out at random off of my TBR for January. This was entirely different than I expected it to be. I will admit, I bought this book because of the absurd cover. I went into it expecting some sort of weird 90s, early 2000s romp, and that is not at all what this is. The cover and title of this book completely misrepresent it. In fact, this book does the lost girl coming back to her hometown to figure herself out story 10 times better than the Monsters of Templeton did. Merle is in her early 30s. At the beginning of the book, she is leaving London, where she's been living for 10 years. She's leaving behind her job editing erotic novels. She's also leaving behind a toxic man-child of a boyfriend of 7 years to go back to her hometown in Ohio. When she gets there, she's forced to face her family's difficult past. She's forced to face everything that has happened since she decided to leave 10 years prior. And she's also coming face to face with why she decided to leave in the first place. Sure, it's kooky at times, but it is legitimately funny in a way that doesn't feel forced. And the writing hits some notes so well that it just knocked the wind out of me. As the book went on, I kept being more and more surprised at how deep and raw and original the story felt. Don't let the cover or the title fool you. This one is certainly worth a read. The next book I finished was A Study in Scarlet by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, followed right after by the short story collection The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes by the same author. I thought A Study in Scarlet was pretty good. I gave it 3 stars. I liked the beginning more than I liked the end of it. It was very interesting to see how Holmes and Watson met originally, which was basically the 19th century version of Craigslist roommate hunting. Part 1 of A Study in Scarlet is Holmes and Watson meeting for the very first time, Watson being introduced to Sherlock's incredible skills of deduction, and then Watson tags along when Sherlock Holmes is asked by the local detectives to help out on a particularly puzzling case. Part 2 establishes the motive behind the murder that they're investigating, but at first I thought that this book may have been misprinted or something because it didn't seem like I was still reading Sherlock Holmes. It seemed totally unrelated up until the very end of part 2, so I wasn't the biggest fan of that. But I was interested enough, of course, to go on to The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. I actually took this book to work and I read 1 story per work day over my lunch break. I liked it marginally more than A Study in Scarlet, but throughout all the stories, I just couldn't help but feeling like I didn't quite know Watson's purpose. Narratively, I see the purpose of Watson. You need to be able to put yourself in his shoes in order to be able to recognize Sherlock's brilliance. These stories wouldn't work if you were seeing things from Sherlock's perspective, especially because these abilities that he has come second nature to him and he doesn't see them as anything special. So I saw Watson's purpose in that way, but other than that, he seems to have really no place in the story. The impression I have always had about Holmes and Watson is that they are a team, a dynamic duo, that Watson is Holmes's sidekick, but he doesn't really seem to do anything. He just kind of tags along. Even with that problem, I did find both very enjoyable. The next book I finished was another audiobook called The Checklist Manifesto by Atul Gawande. This was a book from my young professional TBR, and as you can probably tell from the title, it is a book about the role of a simple checklist in being more productive. Often people feel like they don't need a checklist, especially if the tasks contained within it are extremely simple. They feel like it insults their intelligence. But Atul Gawande argues that especially in increasingly complex situations, they are extremely important and serve as what he calls a cognitive net. If all of the easy stuff about a task is very clearly outlined in a checklist, then that frees up the brain space to be able to attack the more complex aspects of the situation. He says that in complex situations, having a balance of a checklist and the freedom to exercise one's own individual judgment based on the situation is extremely important. That individual's best judgment is only enhanced by the procedure of the checklist. There are many different fields discussed in this book. There is a heavy emphasis on healthcare and surgery because that is Atul Gawande's field. But he does also talk about other fields like the restaurant industry, the construction industry, airline pilots and their extremely honed pre-flight checklists. And he also goes so far as to discuss Walmart's reaction to Hurricane Katrina versus FEMA's. It was a very interesting listen. Nothing about it was earth-shattering. There were a few key observations that I will absolutely take with me, but I'm not sure it was anything more special than that. The next to last book I finished in January was Radiance by Catherine M. Valente. This one started off as a buddy read with Sabrina from Unmanaged Mischief, which I lagged extremely behind on. This book is an amalgamation of so many different genres. It's a little bit sci-fi, a little bit alt history. There's fantasy elements. It very much feels like a noir mystery. There are very dark fairy tale elements to this book, and through all of it is the vein of Hollywood, Tinseltown, because of the strong filmmaking aspect to the story. This was a weird but enjoyable read. On one hand, the writing is gorgeous. Reading it is almost a tactile experience. Some portions of it were so strange. At times I would be like, what is happening? Am I on drugs? I've never done drugs, but I imagine this is what it must feel like. It could definitely get confusing, and the ending was very scattered. I am not the type of reader who needs to have everything tied up in a nice little bow at the end, but if the ending of a book raises more questions than I had during the entirety of the book, it's not my favorite. One thing that it definitely is not is forgettable. I am thinking I'm going to need to give this one a reread at some point. And then at the end of this month, I seem to have acquired Erica from Erica's Epilogues taste in reading, because not only did I finish Radiance, but I also read Sweet Bitter by Stephanie Damler. I picked this one up on a whim after I had finished the Checklist Manifesto. I was looking for a new audiobook and saw it was available through my library. I really enjoyed this book for a lot of the same reasons that Erica did. I will link her review down below if you haven't seen it. She really connected with this book because she works in the restaurant industry, and that's what this book is centered around. It takes place in New York City, the majority of it taking place at a very famous yet unnamed fine dining restaurant. A young woman from the Midwest packs her bags and moves to New York City to start her life all over. By a stroke of luck, she lands a job at this restaurant. The book follows her trials and tribulations working as a back waiter in this restaurant, and also very much focuses on her relationships with the other people working at the restaurant, and how she kind of gets caught up in this sort of love triangle, sort of not. The love triangle in this book, if you can even call it that, reminded me a lot of Euphoria by Lily King, in that our narrator is kind of falling in love with both of them. Our main character really admires and learns a lot from the woman, Simone, who is mentoring her in the food industry and about wine. She and this man who our narrator is attracted to, Jake, are intensely close. They grew up together and they kind of screw each other up for a living. A large chunk of this book is dedicated to the relationship between the three of them, but I will say it is not the strongest component of this book. The atmosphere of the restaurant that this book created was absolutely phenomenal, and it gave such a raw and unfiltered look at what it is really like to work in the restaurant industry. Some of the sentences in this book are so on point, and at times there would be these large chunks of unassigned dialogue. These were used to emulate the chatter, the gossip, the drama that happens in a very small, very interconnected group of people who've been working together forever. That component really translated well to the audiobook, in my opinion. While it was not a 5-star read, I found it completely intoxicating. And I found myself getting a little bit confused when reading the Goodreads reviews for it. A lot of reviewers were saying that it was pretentious, but I'm not quite sure what people expected with a book that is centered around the fine dining industry in one of the food capitals of the world. If you are a foodie like myself and you love atmospheric writing, I highly recommend it. Those were all the books that I finished in January. I'm still reading a few things. My reading slowed down toward the end of the month when I was dealing with a now resolved health issue. I'm finishing up Ivan the Terrible by Isabel de Madariaga for Russian History Retreat, which is coming this weekend. I am reading this art copy of The Patriots by Sana Krasikov. And then all the books I'm planning to get to in February. Like I said, I was going through some stuff at the end of the month, so I had to put down Crime and Punishment, but I am hoping to get back into it this month. I will be buddy reading Dead Souls by Nikolai Gogol, as well as Persuasion by Jane Austen. It was this time last year that I read The Last Werewolf by Glenn Duncan, and so I find myself in the mood to pick up its sequel, Tallulah Rising. I'm also planning on reading Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. I've never read any Neil Gaiman before, and while not all of his books seem like my cup of tea, I've always been very intrigued by this one, and this seems like the right time of year to read it. My Russian History Retreat pick for February does not have a dust jacket, unfortunately, but it is Red Fortress by Catherine Meredale, which is a history of the city of Moscow. And the last book on my TBR is my random pick for the month. Going through my Goodreads to-read list here, option 1 is High Fidelity by Nick Hornby. Fittingly enough, option number 2 is Deathless by Catherine M. Valente. And option number 3 is At Home, A Short History of Private Life by Bill Bryson. I got really excited when I saw option number 3. I have actually never read any Bill Bryson, so that's what I'm going to pick for this month. So those are all the books that I read in January, what I'm currently reading, and what I'm hoping to read in February. If you've heard of any of these books, if you've read any of them, I'd love to hear from you in the comment section below. Or you can find me a variety of places in social media, and all the links to my profiles are in the description box below. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.